Grief does something to a man's judgment that no one adequately prepares you for. It doesn't make you stupid. That's the part people get wrong. It makes you desperate for something real to hold on to. And that desperation, sitting next to a bank account full of money that arrived because someone you loved is gone, is one of the most dangerous combinations a person can carry into the world. Morton Fairbanks was not a foolish man. He was a grieving one. And somewhere on the other side of a screen, in a province south of Manila, someone was already watching for exactly that. This is what 18 months looks like when you're spending a dead woman's gift on a living woman's lie. The last thing Carol said to me that I can still hear clearly, not the final hours, I don't hold on to those, was something she said about 3 weeks before the end. We were sitting in the backyard of our house in Tampa, the one we'd bought together in 1997, and painted twice, and argued about the landscaping for 20 years. And it was one of those Florida evenings in October where the heat finally backs off, and the air actually feels like something you want to be in. She was tired. She was always tired by that point. But she was sitting up, and she had a glass of sweet tea, and she said, "Mort, when this is done, you're going to need to figure out how to be a person again. Don't just be a widower. Actually figure out how to be a person." I said, "Carol, let's not do this right now." She said, "I'm serious. You get too comfortable in a role. You've been my husband for 31 years. And before that, you were your mother's son. And before that, you were your father's helper on the job. You need to actually figure out who you are on your own." I said, "I know who I am." She looked at me with that look she had. Not skeptical, not unkind, just honest. She said, "No, baby, you don't, but you will." She died on a Wednesday in December. The life insurance policy, a $240,000 term policy we'd taken out together in 2003 when our daughter Renata was young and we wanted to make sure things were covered, paid out 3 months later. I sat in my Tampa house with a check for $240,000 and a silence that had replaced 31 years of Carol's presence, and I understood that I had absolutely no idea what to do with either one. I want to be clear about what I was when Cherry Magbanua found me. I was 60 years old. I had worked as a licensed electrician in the Tampa Bay area for 34 years, the last 12 as a contractor running my own small crew. I had a daughter, Renata, who was 28 and lived in Atlanta with her husband and my 2 grandchildren. I had a house with Carol's fingerprints everywhere on it, and a backyard where she'd grown tomatoes for 15 years, and a closet that still smelled like her shampoo 5 months after she died, because I couldn't bring myself to wash the shelf liner. I was not on the internet in any meaningful way before Carol got sick. During her illness, I joined a few Facebook groups to find information, clinical trial updates, support communities for spouses of cancer patients, that kind of thing. After she died, I stayed in some of those groups, because they were the only places where the people understood, without explanation, what I was carrying. There's a particular loneliness to grief that people outside it can't fully reach, and the groups had that understanding in them, and I needed it. The widowers group was called something like Men Who've Lost Partners, a plain functional name for a plain functional need. About 400 members, mostly American and British, men posting at odd hours about the specific difficulties of grief. The first holidays, the paperwork, the way a grocery store could undo you because your wife had a preferred brand of something, and now that brand was just sitting on the shelf being itself. I posted occasionally. I read more than I posted. It helped in the limited way that online things help. Not healing exactly, but the sense of being heard by people who weren't tired of your grief yet. Cherry posted in the group in March, about 5 months after Carol died. Her post was brief and carefully written. She said she'd lost her fiancé to a motorbike accident the previous year, and had found the group searching for people who understood that particular kind of loss, the loss of someone you were planning a future with. She said she hoped it was okay to join, even though she wasn't a man. Several people welcomed her. I was one of them. I left a comment that was generic and kind, and didn't expect anything from it. She messaged me privately 2 days later. I want to describe that message accurately, because it wasn't what you'd expect if you were picturing a scam. It wasn't forward. It wasn't romantic. It was quiet and a little formal, and it said she'd read some of my posts, and that she appreciated the way I talked about Carol, that I made her sound like a real person rather than a loss, and that mattered to someone who was also trying to hold on to the realness of a person they'd lost. She said she was sorry for what I was going through, and that she knew it wasn't the same as losing a fiancé, but that grief was grief, maybe, and she hoped I was finding some okay days. I read that message on a Tuesday evening in my Tampa house, with the television on for background noise and the tomato garden going wild in the backyard, because I hadn't kept up with it, and Carol would have had something to say about that. I read it and I thought, this person understands something about holding on to someone, and I wrote back. What followed was 3 months of daily messages that I can only describe, honestly, as the most genuine human connection I'd had since Carol's last good weeks. I know how that sounds. I know what it reveals about my state of mind, and my isolation, and my need. But I want to be accurate about the experience rather than the interpretation of it, and the experience was that Cherry Magbanua was warm and thoughtful, and asked questions about Carol that made me talk about her in ways I hadn't talked to anyone. Not Renata, not my old work friends, not the grief counselor I'd seen 4 times before deciding I didn't like the way she kept asking about my childhood. Cherry told me about her fiancé Marco. She showed me a photograph, a young Filipino man, laughing, on what looked like a family beach trip. She talked about the specific grief of losing someone you were about to start a life with, the particular cruelty of the future tense becoming past tense. She was eloquent about it in a way that felt true. I believed her completely. I believe she may have been telling a version of some real loss, or she may have borrowed someone else's photograph and built a backstory around it, with the same craft she brought to everything else. I will never know which. By month 3 I was calling her on video. By month 4 I was thinking about her when I woke up, which I noted with a complicated mixture of gratitude and guilt, because I had not thought about anything except Carol's absence when I woke up for 5 months, and the change felt both like relief and like betrayal. By month 5, I had told Renata about her, carefully, framing it as a friendship, and Renata had said, "Dad, please just be careful," in a tone that I'd chosen to read as her being protective, rather than her being right. I bought the one-way ticket to Manila, in month 6 of knowing Cherry. I know what that looks like. I want to explain the thinking, not to justify it, but because I think the thinking is the important part of this story. I wasn't running toward Cherry, exactly. I was running away from the Tampa house that still had Carol in it, in all the ways that hurt, the shampoo on the shelf, the tomato garden gone to seed, the specific silence of Tuesday evenings that had always been Carol's book club night. I was running away from being a widower in the same rooms where I'd been a husband, and Cherry happened to be in the direction I was running. That's not the same as being tricked into buying a ticket. I was a grown man of 60, and I chose to go. But I want you to understand the condition I was in when I chose it, because the condition matters. I told Renata the week before I left. We talked on the phone for a long time, and she asked questions that were good questions. How well did I actually know Cherry? What did I know about her family? Had I met her in person yet? What were my plans if things didn't work out? And I answered them all in the reasonable-sounding, but ultimately evasive way of a man who has already decided and is presenting the conversation as consultation rather than actually consulting. Renata said, "Dad, you have $240,000 in savings right now. Please don't do anything with it until you've been there for at least 6 months and actually know what you're walking into." I said yes, of course, absolutely, and I meant it when I said it. I landed in Manila on a Tuesday morning in June, and Cherry was at the arrivals hall with a small handwritten sign that said Morton in block letters, which I found both touching and slightly funny because I was the only Caucasian man of a certain age walking through that gate, and she probably didn't need the sign. She was smaller than she'd looked on video. She had a wide, warm smile, and she hugged me with the genuine physical ease of someone who'd been looking forward to this. I hugged her back and thought, okay, this is real. Whatever comes next, this part is real. We spent the first 2 weeks in a guest house in Cavite Province, south of Manila. Cherry lived with her family there. Her mother Erlinda, her father Domingo, and her younger brother Arnel, in a concrete house on a residential street in a town called Dasmarinas. I met them on my third day. Erlinda was warm and fed me aggressively and didn't speak much English, but communicated hospitality clearly through quantity of food. Domingo was quiet and thin, and shook my hand with both of his. Arnel was 22, and worked at a loading bay in a nearby industrial estate, and regarded me with the careful assessment of a young man sizing up the American his sister had brought home. I stayed in the guest house. Cherry came each day, and we did what people do at the beginning. We walked and ate and talked, and she showed me her town, and I tried to learn what her life looked like up close, versus from the other side of a screen. It looked real. That's what I keep coming back to. Her family was real. Her neighborhood was real. The photographs of Marco on her phone were still there, and she still touched them with that specific grief that I recognized because I had my own version of it for Carol. She brought up the house in month 3, not as a request, as a dream, the way people talk about things they want but don't expect. She said that what she'd always hoped for, eventually, was a small house of their own, rather than living with family. She said she was 38. She had told me she was 28 on her profile, but now said it was a mistake in her sign-up, and that she'd never had her own space. She said she knew it was too much to think about right now. She was just sharing. I sat with that for 2 weeks. Then I brought it up myself. I said I'd been thinking about what she'd said about a house. I said that if we were serious about a future together, and I believed we were, then maybe we should talk about building something here. Somewhere she could be while I sorted out the logistics of longer-term residence. I said I had money available and that I wanted to use it toward something real, rather than letting it sit in a Tampa bank account feeling like Carol's death. I know how that last sentence sounds. At the time it sounded, to me, like honesty. Like the kind of clear-eyed thing you say when you're ready to stop treating grief as something to be managed and start treating it as something to be moved through. I told myself that spending that money on a future was what Carol would have wanted. I told myself that because I needed to tell myself something, and that was the thing that felt most true in the condition I was in. The house construction began in month 6, a parcel of land on the outskirts of Dasmarinas, about 2 kilometers from Cherry's family home. The title was in Cherry's name, she explained, because Philippine law restricted foreign land ownership, and this was simply how it had to work. We'd sort out the formalities once I had a permanent visa and we were married. I knew about the foreign ownership restriction because I'd read about it, and the explanation was accurate, so I accepted it. I wired $45,000 to cover the land purchase and the initial construction phase. I want to describe how the $45,000 felt, because it's important to the story. It felt like action. It felt like the first purposeful thing I'd done since the funeral. I had spent 7 months in suspension, managing grief, managing the house in Tampa, managing the slow disintegration of the life Carol and I had built. And here was something concrete, a foundation going in, walls rising, a physical thing in the world that meant something. I visited the site on the 3rd week of construction and stood in the footprint of what was going to be a house, and I felt, for the first time in almost a year, like a man building towards something, rather than a man who had lost something he couldn't replace. The engagement happened in month 7. Cherry's idea. She said she didn't need a ring, didn't need a ceremony. She just wanted to know we were headed somewhere, and I said yes, we were, and we told her family over dinner, and Erlinda cried, and Domingo shook my hand again, both hands again, with what felt like genuine feeling. I called Renata that night. She was very quiet on the phone. She said, "Dad, how long have you actually known her?" I said we'd been talking for over a year. She said, "You've been in the country for 4 months." I said, "Renata." She said, "I'm not going to fight with you about this. I just want you to be careful." I said I was being careful. I was not being careful. I want to be honest about that. I was being hopeful, which is a completely different thing. Domingo's kidneys appeared in month 9. Cherry came to the guest house. I had moved from the original place to a slightly larger apartment closer to the construction site, which cost $420 a month, with her phone showing photographs of her father at a dialysis center. She said he had chronic kidney disease that had progressed faster than expected and was now requiring 3 sessions of dialysis per week. The cost was significant, she said. The family's savings were stretched. She wasn't asking me, she said. She just wanted me to know what was happening. I gave her $12,000 for Domingo's treatment over the next 4 months. I met Domingo regularly during this period, and he looked, I thought, like a man managing a serious illness. Tired, diminished, quieter than before. I had no way to verify whether he was actually receiving dialysis or what the actual costs were. I didn't try to verify. It did not occur to me, at that point, to verify. He was my fiancé's father, and he was sick, and I had money, and that was the full extent of my analysis. The construction problems started in month 10. The original contractor had, Cherry explained, cut corners on the foundation. She'd had to let him go and bring in a new crew, which had identified structural issues with the first pour that needed to be addressed before the walls could continue. An additional $28,000 to fix the foundation and resume work. I wired it. I visited the site, and there was indeed work happening. Men with tools, concrete being poured, the real sounds and smells of construction that I knew well from my years as an electrician, and that felt legitimate to my trained eye. What I didn't know, what I had no framework to notice, was that I was watching a performance of construction rather than construction itself. I know that now. A neighbor told me later, in halting English with Cherry's brother translating, which added a layer of unreliability I've had to accept, that the site had actually been completed and sold several months before I arrived, and what I was watching on my visits was a rented performance of ongoing work, the same crew appearing when Cherry knew I was coming. The land title I'd been shown was not for the parcel I thought I'd purchased. The $240,000 had bought a very convincing ongoing fiction. By month 13 I had wired, in total, $187,000. Construction, Domingo's dialysis, the engagement party Cherry said her family expected, a car that Cherry said she needed for transportation to the dialysis center with her father, a series of smaller amounts for things I can no longer itemize because I stopped keeping records somewhere around month 10 when keeping records felt like distrust. Renata called me in month 14. She said she'd been talking to a woman in an expat support group online, a woman whose father had been in a similar situation in Cavite, and she wanted to ask me some specific questions. She asked if the construction site had an address I could give her. She asked what the title number on the land was. She asked whether I had any documentation of Domingo's medical treatment, any receipts from the dialysis center. I said I could get those things. She said, "Dad, I need you to get them before you send another $1." I spent a week trying to get those things. Cherry had answers for every question, but the answers, when I pushed, led to further questions rather than to documentation. The title number she gave me came back, when I checked the Registry of Deeds online, as a property in a completely different barangay, registered to a name I didn't recognize. The dialysis center she named didn't appear in any registry I could find. The contractor she'd mentioned as fixing the foundation had a name that I could find no business registration for. I stopped sleeping properly around that time. Not dramatically. I wasn't having panic attacks or anything cinematic. Just the quiet, grinding insomnia of a man whose mind won't stop running a problem he's afraid to finish solving. I'd lie in the apartment at 2 in the morning, listening to the street sounds, and thinking about the house, and the dialysis, and the foundation, and Carol's $240,000, and I would not let myself complete the thought, because completing the thought meant something I wasn't ready to know. The neighbor was a man named Nestor, who lived across the street from the construction site, and who I had spoken to a few times during my visits. He spoke better English than he'd let on initially. On my visit in month 15, a visit Cherry had seemed anxious about, without saying why, Nestor came across the street while Cherry was on a phone call near the road and spoke to me quietly and quickly. He said the house on this land had been completed last year. He said he had watched it be finished and sold. He said new people had been living in it for 8 months until 3 weeks ago, when it had been vacated suddenly. He said the crew I saw on my visits appeared only on days when he could see my rental car parked outside. I thanked him. My voice worked. I don't know how. Cherry came back from her phone call, and I looked at her, and she looked at me, and something passed between us. I don't know what she saw in my face, but she saw something, because her expression changed slightly, in a way I'd never seen before. A recalibration. Very brief, she said. Ready to go? And I said yes. And we got in the car and drove back toward Dasmarinas. And neither of us said much. And the road went past rice fields and small shops, and the ordinary Philippine afternoon, doing its ordinary things around a situation that was not ordinary at all. I didn't confront her that evening. I went back to the apartment, and I sat at the small table where I'd eaten breakfast every morning for 15 months, and I opened my banking records on my laptop, and I added up every transfer I'd made since arriving in the Philippines. The number took me 3 attempts to add correctly, because I kept making arithmetic errors that I think my brain was manufacturing deliberately. When the number was right, and stayed right across 3 separate calculations, it was $214,000. I had $26,000 remaining of Carol's $240,000. I had a Tampa house I hadn't sold. I had a half-finished construction site that Nestor said wasn't mine, and wasn't unfinished. I had a fiancé whose father's dialysis I had been paying for, and whose illness may or may not have been real. I had 18 months of my life, and the grief from which I'd been trying to outrun, still there, still intact, now sitting on top of everything else. I called Renata. It was 3 a.m. Tampa time, and she answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been waiting for this call, which meant she'd known it was coming, which meant she was a better judge of this than I had been for a very long time. I told her the number. She said, "Oh, Daddy," just that. The way she'd said it when she was small, and something had gone wrong that couldn't be fixed quickly. I said, "I need to come home." She said, "I'll book the flight." I didn't see Cherry before I left. I sent her a message that morning. A single message, not angry, not accusatory, just the facts as I understood them. I said I knew about Nestor. I said I knew about the house. I said I had counted the money, and I knew what was gone. I said I wasn't going to pursue anything, because I didn't know what pursuing anything would achieve, and because I was tired in a way that went deeper than anger, and because I needed to use whatever I had left on getting my own life back together, rather than on trying to recover something from a situation where recovery was probably not the realistic outcome. She didn't reply for 6 hours. When she finally did, the message said, "I'm sorry, Mort. I really did care about you." I read that sitting in a taxi to Ninoy Aquino International Airport, with 1 bag and $26,000, and 18 months of my life, and Carol's money redistributed into a future that wasn't mine. I read it and I thought about what sorry meant in that context, and whether caring and deceiving were actually as incompatible as I'd always believed. I didn't reply. I put the phone in my pocket and watched Manila go past the window and tried to think of nothing until the airport appeared and I could stop watching the city and start watching the departures board instead. Renata picked me up in Atlanta. She'd flown up from her house because she didn't want me to land and be alone. She looked at me in the arrivals hall and I could see her doing the careful thing that people who love you do, measuring what they're seeing against what they're prepared to say, and she decided to say nothing and just put her arms around me and hold on. I let her. I didn't say anything either. We stood there in the arrivals hall at Hartsfield with people moving around us, and I just let my daughter hold me until I felt less like I might come apart. She drove me to a hotel near the airport. She'd thought about this, had a room booked, had a plan for the next few days that included food and rest and no major decisions. I sat in the hotel room that first evening and looked at the beige walls and the clean impersonal furniture and thought about the Tampa house waiting for me with Carol's shampoo on the shelf, and I felt something that I still don't have a precise word for. Not grief exactly, or not just grief. Something more complicated. The grief for Carol, which had never left, and which I had been trying to outrun instead of walk through. And layered over it, something else. A kind of shame that was specific to what I'd done with her money. Not because I'd been conned, or not only because of that, but because of why I'd been susceptible to being conned. Carol had told me I didn't know who I was without a role to play, and I had spent 15 months in the Philippines playing a role. Provider, protector, builder of futures, man with a plan, because playing a role was so much more manageable than sitting quietly in my own life and figuring out what she'd told me I needed to figure out. The $240,000 is gone. $26,000 left. The Tampa house is worth about $310,000, and I still own it, and that's what I'm living on now. The equity of the house, and the quiet of knowing that I have a roof, and a daughter who drives to airports in the middle of complicated situations, and a granddaughter named Carol, for her grandmother, who is 4 years old and has her great-grandmother's eyes. I go to grief counseling now. Not the one from before, a different one. A man named Dr. Ashford who I found through Renata, and who doesn't ask about my childhood unless my childhood is actually relevant. He asked me, early on, whether I blamed Cherry for what happened. I said I blamed her for the fraud. Yes, the fake house, the fake dialysis, the fake title. I didn't blame her for the fact that I was susceptible to it. That part was mine. I had arrived in her country with $240,000 of my dead wife's money, and an unprocessed wall of grief, and a desperate need to feel like I was building something real, instead of sitting in a Tampa house, learning to be a person on my own, the way Carol had told me I needed to do. Cherry found that. She didn't create it. She found it, the way you find a door that's already open and walk through. Dr. Ashford asked me once what I would say to Carol if I could. I thought about it for a while. I said I'd tell her she was right. I didn't know who I was without a role, and I spent her last gift proving it. I'd tell her I was working on it now, slower than I should have started, but working on it. I'd tell her the tomato garden is coming back. I went home to Tampa 2 months after landing in Atlanta, and I cleared it out and put new plants in, and they're doing well. Better than I expected, actually. The soil was still good. It just needed someone to pay attention to it. She always said I got too comfortable in a role. What I'm trying to do now, what I'm actually doing for the first time in my adult life, is be uncomfortable enough to find out what's underneath all the roles. What's there when you're not someone's son, or someone's employee, or someone's husband, or someone's mark? I don't fully know yet. I'm 61 years old, and I'm still finding out. But I'm in the right house now, the right city, the right life, and I'm paying attention.